At dawn, the battlefield was quiet enough to feel merciful. A pale light hung over the land, revealing ranks of soldiers who still believed they had time. They stood confident in their formation, weapons ready, banners steady in the morning air. For days they had marched with purpose, convinced they were the hunters, not the prey. Every map, every report, every instinct told them they were in control. Then the truth arrived all at once. Scouts returned breathless, their faces drained of color. Hills that had been empty the night before were suddenly alive with movement. Valleys, once thought impassable, now crawled with enemy standards. Roads behind them were no longer roads at all, but walls of steel in flesh. What had seemed like open ground was closing, tightening, sealing. Within minutes, confidence curdled into disbelief. Orders were shouted, then shouted again, sharper this time, as commanders tried to force order onto a reality that no longer obeyed them.
Units turned, reformed, turned again, each movement revealing the same nightmare. North, south, east, west. Every direction told the same story. They were no longer advancing. They were surrounded. For the men in the ranks, the realization was physical. Stomachs sank. Mouths went dry. Some stared ahead as if refusing to accept what their eyes were telling them. Others gripped their weapons tighter, knuckles white, as though steel alone could carve a way out. The calm of the morning shattered, replaced by the low, spreading sound of fear. Being surrounded is not just a tactical problem. It is a psychological one. It means no retreat, no relief, no promise of rescue. It means every loss cannot be replaced, every mistake magnified. The enemy is not just in front of you, but everywhere, watching, waiting, closing in with patience. And yet, surrender was not immediate. These were not men who expected to die here.
They had victories behind them, reputations to protect, leaders who had never known defeat. Even now, some believed this was a feint, a temporary danger that discipline and courage could overcome. Some prayed quietly, others cursed the officers who had led them here, and a few simply laughed in disbelief. Horses stamped nervously, sensing what their riders would not yet say aloud. Time seemed to slow, stretching each heartbeat, as if the world itself hesitated before revealing what this encirclement truly meant. For many, hesitation was the last moment they would know. But the circle kept tightening. Signals went unanswered. Messengers never returned. The realization spread silently from rank to rank. This was no accident. This was a trap, carefully prepared, perfectly timed. Someone else had planned this day better than they had. As the sun climbed higher, so did the certainty that escape was no longer an option.
The battlefield had become a cage, and everyone inside could feel the bars. What followed would not be decided by numbers alone, but by a choice, one so extreme that it would echo far beyond this field and into history itself. Long before the first soldier realized he was surrounded, forces far beyond the battlefield had already set this moment in motion. This confrontation was not born from a single decision or a sudden mistake. It was the result of years, sometimes decades, of ambition, fear, and calculated risk taken by rival powers who believed history could be bent to their will. On one side stood an empire built on order. Its strength came from structure, disciplined armies, rigid hierarchies, and a belief that stability was the highest form of power. Borders were drawn carefully, defended aggressively, and expanded only when the numbers made sense. To its leaders, war was a tool, not a passion. Every campaign was measured, every loss weighed against long-term gain. Opposing them was a force shaped by instability. Their world was less predictable, driven by survival, opportunity, and the constant pressure of encroaching rivals. Where the empire relied on tradition, this power relied on adaptability. They moved faster, struck unexpectedly, and understood terrain and timing in ways their enemies often underestimated. To them, war was not just strategy, it was necessity. Between these two worlds, tension grew quietly. Treaties were signed and broken.
Borders shifted, sometimes by ink, sometimes by blood. Each side believed the other would eventually back down. Each misread patience for weakness. The land where they now stood had changed hands many times before. It was a crossroads, valuable, contested, and impossible to ignore. Control of it meant influence over trade, movement, and prestige. Losing it meant vulnerability. Neither side could afford to step away, even as the risks mounted. As months turned into years, smaller clashes hardened attitudes. Skirmishes became campaigns. Victories bred overconfidence, while defeats planted resentment. Advisors warned of escalation, but momentum had taken over. Armies were raised not because war was inevitable, but because stopping felt impossible. From a distance, the coming clash looked orderly, almost inevitable. Plans were drawn, supply lines calculated, contingencies prepared. Maps suggested clean movements and decisive outcomes. On paper, it was a contest of logic, but paper does not account for pride. Commanders on both sides believed they understood their enemy. Each assumed the other would react predictably when pressured. Each believed they held the advantage, even as warning signs accumulated. The empire trusted its discipline. The opposing force trusted its ability to disrupt. Neither fully grasped how these assumptions would collide. By the time armies marched, the outcome already felt written. Not because one side was weaker, but because the system that guided them left no room for retreat. Strategy demanded commitment. Politics demanded victory. Reputation demanded resolve. And so, step by step, maneuver by maneuver, they were drawn towards this field. The encirclement that shocked the soldiers that morning was not sudden at all. It was the final consequence of choices made far away long ago. Choices that transformed distant ambitions into immediate, inescapable danger. Inside the tightening circle were not nameless figures, but men shaped by loyalty, habit, and belief. They came from different regions, spoke different dialects, and carried different reasons for being there. Some were veterans hardened by years of marching and fighting. Others were young, still carrying the quiet hope that war would make them something more than they had been before. At the center stood the commanders. These were men raised on doctrine and reputation, taught that authority depended on composure. Even now, with the enemy pressing in, they forced their voices steady, their faces unreadable. To show doubt was to invite collapse. Each had been promoted for obedience to the system, for trusting plans, for believing that discipline could overcome chaos. To survive by yielding meant living with that weight forever, if survival even came. Fear moved through the ranks unevenly. Some men were visibly shaken, hands trembling, eyes darting toward the encircling hills. Others grew unnervingly calm, as if accepting the situation brought relief. Jokes surfaced, dark and desperate, laughter breaking out at the wrong moments. It was not courage or cowardice, but a human response to the unbearable. What bound them together was identity. They were soldiers of this force, wearing these colors, carrying this legacy. To abandon it felt like erasing themselves. Even those who doubted the cause still clung to the brotherhood formed in shared hardship. Leaving meant leaving each other behind. Hope did not vanish, but it changed shape. It was no longer hope of victory, but hope of meaning. If they were to die here, then it had to matter. If they were to fight, then it had to be remembered. Survival and honor began to pull in opposite directions, stretching the men inside the circle to their limits. As the encirclement tightened, these inner conflicts sharpened. Every man felt it differently, but all felt it deeply. Understanding who they were and what they believed is the only way to understand why, when escape was gone, surrender was not the path they chose. In moments like this, identity becomes armor and burden at once. It shields men from panic, yet traps them in expectations forged long before this field. The circle around them was made of enemies, but the pressure inside was just as relentless, shaping every breath, every thought, every coming decision. None of them would ever be the same. The encirclement did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded quietly, almost politely, hidden behind routine movements and familiar patterns. At first, the enemy appeared exactly where they were expected to be, probing at the front, testing defenses, retreating just enough to suggest caution rather than intent. Behind the lines, warning signs flickered and faded. Scouts reported distant movement,
but distance made it easy to dismiss. Commanders assumed delays were weather, terrain, or fear. Each small anomaly had a reasonable explanation, and so none felt urgent. Control, at least on the maps, seemed intact. What went unseen was coordination. While attention remained fixed forward, enemy units flowed along ridges, through forests, and across paths thought impassable. They moved at night, light and silent, guided by locals and long familiarity with the land. Where the surrounded force saw barriers, the enemy saw corridors. Supply routes were the first to disappear. A convoy failed to arrive. Then another. Messengers sent to confirm positions never returned. Still, headquarters believed the situation manageable.
After all, the main army was still visible ahead, still retreating, still playing its part. Then pressure began to build from the flanks. Skirmishes erupted where none were expected. Small units found themselves engaged, then cut off, then gone. Reports conflicted. Maps were redrawn, erased, redrawn again. Awareness lagged behind reality by hours, sometimes days. The final stage came with brutal efficiency. Once the surrounding forces were in position, they revealed themselves almost simultaneously. Hills erupted with banners, valleys filled with movement, roads vanished under advancing formations. What had been scattered contact became a solid, unbroken ring. Attempts to break out were immediate and frantic. Units pushed toward what they believed were weak points, only to collide with fresh troops waiting for them. Every thrust met resistance. Every retreat closed another gap. Chaos replaced command as signals failed and orders contradicted one another.
By the time leaders understood the scale of the disaster, options were already gone. The enemy had not rushed. They had waited. They had allowed confusion to bloom, knowing panic would finish what strategy had begun. Escape did not vanish suddenly. It dissolved, piece by piece, until nothing remained. In that moment, the battlefield transformed. Open ground became walls. Distance became confinement. The surrounded force was no longer fighting an army, but a design. And as the circle locked shut, one truth became unavoidable. This was not a mistake. It was mastery. From the outside, it looked like inevitability, but inside, it felt like suffocation. Every sound carried closer, every movement observed. The illusion of space collapsed, replaced by the sense that the enemy was always just beyond sight, adjusting, tightening, waiting. Control had given way to chaos so completely that even seasoned veterans struggled to orient themselves. In losing awareness, they lost time.
In losing time, they lost freedom. And with freedom gone, the reality of total encirclement finally settled in. There was no corner left untouched, no silence unclaimed, no path remaining open at all times. The moment of realization did not arrive with a shout or a signal. It crept in quietly, carried by absence. No returning scouts, no answering horns, no movement where movement should have been. What remained was a growing, unmistakable stillness that pressed down on every man inside the circle. Leaders gathered in tight groups, voices lowered, eyes fixed on the ground between them. Maps were unfolded again, though everyone already knew what they would show. Routes marked in charcoal no longer existed. Positions they hoped were thin had gone dark, then hostile. One by one, the last possibilities were spoken aloud and dismissed. For the soldiers, the truth spread without words. Men looked outward and saw the same faces watching from the hills, closer now than before.
They turned inward and saw fear reflected back at them. The idea of rescue faded first, then the idea of retreat. Finally, even the idea of delay vanished. Time, like space, had run out. Despair settled unevenly. Some sank to the ground, staring blankly, as if stillness might make the world pause. Others paced, restless and angry, cursing fate, commanders, gods, anything that might absorb the blame. A few wept openly, thinking of homes they would never see again. There was no shame in it. Everyone understood. Whispers filled the camp. Questions passed from man to man. How long could they hold? Would the enemy accept surrender? Would they keep their word? No one had answers. History offered only uncertainty. Stories of mercy were always followed by stories of betrayal. The officers faced a different weight. To order surrender meant preserving lives, but at the cost of honor, reputation, and possibly punishment if they survived.
To order resistance meant near certain death, but with meaning attached. Reason argued for survival. Resolve argued for something else entirely. As debate continued, options narrowed to grim variations of the same end. Fight and be destroyed slowly, surrender and trust the enemy's mercy, or choose a path no one wanted to name aloud. The unspoken idea hovered at the edge of every conversation, dark and heavy. Hope flickered one last time. Not hope of escape, but hope of clarity. Men searched their leaders' faces for certainty, for direction, for something solid to hold on to. What they found instead was silence. Long, deliberate silence. That silence mattered. In it, fear began to transform. Despair hardened into resolve. Panic gave way to something colder, sharper. If this was the end, then it would be faced deliberately, not begged away. Finally, a decision began to take shape, not announced, not yet shared, but felt. It passed through the ranks as a tension, a tightening in the chest, a shared understanding that something irreversible was coming. Surrender was no longer the center of the discussion. Something far more extreme was forming in its place. The battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Even the enemy waited, and in that pause, before steel moved and history shifted, the men inside the circle crossed an invisible line, from seeking a way out to choosing how they would be remembered. The decision did not come as a dramatic announcement. There was no single command shouted across the camp, no banner raised to signal the final choice. Instead, it emerged gradually, almost organically, as leaders spoke quietly and men listened without interruption. It was the kind of decision that could only exist once every other option had been stripped away. By any measure of logic, survival should have come first. The numbers were against them. Supplies were dwindling. Relief was impossible. Every principle of warfare argued for surrender or negotiation, and yet logic no longer held absolute power here. Something else had taken its place: belief. For some, it was belief in honor, an idea shaped since childhood, reinforced by stories of ancestors who refused to kneel even when defeat was certain. For others, it was belief in legacy, the understanding that how this moment ended would define everything that came before it. To survive stripped of dignity felt to them like a slower kind of death. Desperation played its part as well. When the future offers nothing but captivity, humiliation, or execution, the present becomes sharper, more urgent. In that narrow space, choices are no longer measured by probability, but by meaning. If death was unavoidable, then it would be chosen, not assigned. The commanders understood the weight of what they were considering. This was not bravery in the conventional sense. It was a rejection of the natural instinct to preserve oneself at all costs. They knew how history judged such moments, sometimes as heroism, sometimes as madness. There would be no middle ground. Slowly, agreement formed, not unanimous, but sufficient. No one was forced. Men who could not accept it were allowed to step away, though few did. Most remained, bound not by orders, but by shared resolve. In choosing this path, they chose each other. The atmosphere shifted. Fear did not disappear, but it changed character. Where panic had ruled, now there was focus. Weapons were checked, armor adjusted, final words exchanged. Some wrote messages that would never be delivered. Others simply stood in silence, committing faces to memory. This was the unthinkable decision, not to wait for the enemy's terms, not to gamble on mercy, but to seize control of the ending. They would act, not react. They would define the moment, rather than be consumed by it. History often portrays such choices as sudden, but this one was heavy, deliberate, and painfully aware of its cost. Every man involved knew there would be no undoing it. Once begun, it would carry them beyond fear, beyond negotiation, beyond return. As preparations finished, the weight of inevitability settled in. Across the field, the enemy sensed movement, but could not yet understand it. Inside the circle, resolve hardened into readiness. A line had been crossed, and the future narrowed to a single point. What followed would not merely decide the outcome of a battle. It would challenge every expectation of how surrounded men were supposed to behave, and force the world to reckon with a choice that defied reason and embraced something far more enduring. Action came without ceremony. One moment there was stillness, the next there was movement, sudden and violent. as the surrounded force surged forward with a unity born of finality. Orders were no longer debated, they were executed.
Steel was drawn, shields raised, and the space between decision and consequence vanished. The enemy did not expect this. They had prepared for surrender, for a slow collapse, for desperation turned inward. Instead, they were met with momentum. The encircled force struck not as scattered remnants, but as a single mass, driving toward a chosen point with ferocious intent. Surprise rippled through the opposing lines as discipline met disbelief. Noise swallowed the field. The clash of metal, the cries of the wounded, the thunder of boots on churned earth replaced the tense silence that had lingered moments before. Men fought knowing there would be no retreat, and that knowledge stripped away hesitation. Blows were heavier, movements sharper. Fear no longer whispered of survival, but of failure. This was defiance given form. Every step forward was an argument against fate itself. The enemy pushed back hard, numbers asserting themselves, formations bending but not breaking.
Bodies fell, lines wavered, and yet the surrounded force kept moving, carried by momentum that logic could not explain. Individual acts of sacrifice began to shape the larger story. Soldiers threw themselves into gaps to hold them open seconds longer. Officers fought where the fighting was thickest, not to inspire, but because there was nowhere else to be. Men dragged wounded comrades forward instead of back, knowing forward was the only direction left. Expectation unraveled on both sides. The enemy had assumed control. Instead, they were reacting. Orders arrived late. Units hesitated, unsure whether this was a breakout, a last stand, or something else entirely. That uncertainty cost them time, and time was the only currency the surrounded force still possessed. Fate pressed in regardless. Casualties mounted. The advance slowed. The reality of numbers reasserted itself with brutal clarity. And yet, even as momentum faltered, something irreversible had already occurred.
The encircled force had rewritten the moment. They were no longer victims awaiting an end, but actors forcing one. The climax was not a single blow, but a culmination. When the forward motion finally broke, when resistance became impossible, the field bore witness to what defiance looked like when carried to its limit. The enemy stood victorious by measure of force, but unsettled, aware they had faced something they did not anticipate. Steel fell silent eventually. What remained was shock, not at the violence, but at the will behind it. In choosing action over inevitability, the surrounded force had altered the meaning of defeat itself, and as the echoes faded, it became clear that whatever followed, the story could never return to what anyone had expected. In that instant, destiny was challenged openly, and though fate prevailed, it did so marked forever by resistance that refused to vanish quietly into the margins of history and echo after the battle ended.
When the fighting stopped, it did so unevenly, as if the battlefield itself needed time to understand that the storm had passed. The clash of steel faded first, then the shouts, then finally the desperate cries that lingered longest. What followed was not peace, but an unsettling quiet that pressed against every survivor. Smoke drifted low across the ground, blurring the shapes of bodies and broken formations. The earth was torn open, darkened by blood and churned by boots that would never move again. Weapons lay where they had fallen, some still gripped by hands that no longer felt their weight. The air carried the sharp smell of iron and dust, heavy enough to taste. Those who remained standing looked around in disbelief. Men who had fought through countless battles now struggled to process what they were seeing. Victory had come, but it did not feel clean or triumphant. It felt expensive. The enemy had won the field, yet the cost was written everywhere they looked.
Survivors from the surrounded force were few. Some sat in stunned silence, staring at nothing, their expressions hollow. Others moved slowly among the fallen, searching for familiar faces, finding too many of them. There was no cheering, no celebration, only exhaustion so deep it bordered on numbness. Commanders on the victorious side walked the ground carefully, speaking in hushed tones. This was not how they had expected the battle to end. They had planned for surrender, for compliance, for order restored. Instead, they were left with questions. Why had these men chosen this path? What had driven them to reject survival so completely? Witnesses struggled to put words to it. Some called it madness, Others called it bravery. Most said nothing at all, sensing that any explanation would fall short. The sheer will displayed in that final action unsettled them more than the violence itself. As the sun dipped lower, the stillness deepened. Birds returned cautiously.
Wind moved through torn banners. The battlefield, once alive with chaos, now felt like a place set apart from the rest of the world, a space where something irreversible had occurred. Only then did the realization settle in. This was not just another victory, not just another defeat. What had happened here would not fade quickly. It would be spoken about in camps and courts, argued over by scholars, reshaped by memory. The silence was not emptiness, it was weight. Every war leaves bodies behind. Few leave questions this heavy. The immediate aftermath was defined not by triumph, but by reflection, by the dawning understanding that the surrounded force had forced everyone present to confront uncomfortable truths about courage, choice, and cost. As night approached, fires were lit, reports prepared, and the machinery of war began moving again. But beneath it all lingered a shared awareness that something historic had taken place. The storm had passed, yet its echo remained, hanging in the quiet air, waiting to follow the story beyond this field and into memory. News of what happened did not travel quickly, but when it did, it refused to stay contained. Messengers carried fragments of the story to distant cities and camps, each retelling shaped by exhaustion, shock, and disbelief. What they described did not fit neatly into existing ideas of victory or defeat, and that alone ensured it would spread. At first, many refused to believe it. Accounts of a surrounded force choosing defiance over surrender sounded exaggerated, even convenient. Surely the story had grown in the telling. Surely panic or confusion had been mistaken for resolve. Leaders accustomed to orderly conclusions preferred explanations that preserved familiar rules of war. But the reports kept coming, from different directions, from opposing sides, from witnesses who agreed on little else. The core of the story remained the same.
The encircled force had acted deliberately. They had chosen confrontation knowing it would cost them everything. That consistency made dismissal harder. Reactions fractured along predictable lines. Some spoke of admiration, framing the event as a final stand worthy of remembrance. They emphasized courage, loyalty, and the refusal to yield. In their telling, the men inside the circle became symbols, stripped of doubt and fear, elevated into examples of idealized honor. Others responded with unease. If such choices were celebrated, what did that say about the value of survival? What precedent did it set for future conflicts? To them, the story was dangerous, not because it inspired weakness, but because it glorified sacrifice beyond reason. As time passed, details began to blur. Numbers shifted, speeches were invented, motives were simplified. Where the truth had been complex and conflicted, memory preferred clarity.
The men who had hesitated, questioned, or doubted slowly disappeared from the narrative, replaced by cleaner, sharper figures who embodied a single idea. Songs were written, accounts were copied and embellished. The battlefield became a reference point rather than a place, its geography reshaped by imagination. Each retelling moved the story further from the dust and blood of that day and closer to something symbolic. Yet beneath the legend, traces of reality persisted. Those who had been there remembered exhaustion, confusion, and fear alongside resolve. They remembered how close surrender had been, how heavy the decision felt. Their quieter accounts rarely traveled as far, but they anchored the story to human experience. Over generations, the event took on a life of its own. It was invoked to inspire soldiers, to justify decisions, to warn against underestimating desperation.
The men inside the circle became representatives rather than individuals, their choices used to serve causes they could never have imagined. In this way, history transformed into memory, and memory into myth. What began as a desperate choice on a single field became a story that outgrew its origins. The truth did not vanish, but it became layered, buried beneath meaning, interpretation, and need. And that transformation mattered, because the power of the event no longer lay only in what happened, but in what people believed had happened. In that belief, the story continued to shape minds long after the battlefield fell silent, proving that some moments do not end when the fighting stops, they begin there. Centuries later, the battlefield itself has faded, grass has reclaimed the ground, landmarks have shifted or vanished, and yet the moment refuses to disappear.
It lingers not because of who won, but because of how the surrounded force chose to face the end.
In military terms, the outcome was clear. They were destroyed. The enemy held the field. By every conventional measure, it was a defeat. And yet, history has never treated it that simply. This moment endured because it challenged a core assumption of warfare, that survival is always the highest objective. Strategists still study the encirclement for its lessons in planning, deception, and coordination. It stands as a warning about overconfidence, about mistaking order for control. But alongside those technical lessons runs a deeper current, one that cannot be plotted on a map. The choice made inside the circle exposed something fundamental about human psychology. When escape is impossible and the future offers no dignity, people begin to measure life differently. Meaning competes with survival. Legacy challenges instinct. In rare moments, belief becomes stronger than fear. Cultures across time have returned to this story because it forces uncomfortable questions.
Is survival at any cost truly victory? Can a defeat still matter? Can an ending shape the future more powerfully than success? The fact that these questions persist explains why the event still resonates. The men who made that decision did not know how they would be remembered. They did not know their actions would be debated, admired, criticized, and mythologized. They acted within the limits of their moment, driven by pressure, belief, and the need to choose something when nothing good remained. That is why the story endures, not because it offers clear answers, but because it refuses to provide them. Being surrounded did not mean they were powerless. In the final moments, they reclaimed agency. They chose how the story would end, even if they could not change how it would conclude. In doing so, they ensured that defeat did not equal erasure. History is filled with victories that are forgotten. This was not one of them.
The echoes of that choice have shaped how later generations understand courage, sacrifice, and resistance. It has been used to inspire, to warn, and to remind leaders that human will does not always obey logic. Even now, the story unsettles because it suggests that control is never absolute, and outcomes are not always the final measure of significance. In the end, what haunts history is not the violence, but the clarity of the choice. When surrounded, stripped of options, and staring at an unavoidable end, these men decided who they would be in their last moments. And that leaves a question no retelling can avoid. If you had stood inside that circle, knowing there was no way out, knowing survival meant surrender, knowing defiance meant death, what would you have chosen? Because history does not remember the answer easily. It remembers that the question was asked.